The cliff stood like a broken tooth at the edge of the red plateau, raw and sheer, its face streaked with mineral veins that shimmered faintly under the twin suns of Virellia. It rose more than 900 feet straight into the atmosphere, ending in a jagged crown that cut across the horizon. The locals called it the Unclimbable Thought not because of what it was, but because of what it represented: the limit of logic, the boundary of reason. Professor Drelks had been lecturing in front of a crowd of mixed species, his 6 thin arms gesturing with slow, deliberate confidence. His head, large and ovular, tilted toward the sky as he spoke through the translator clipped to his thorax. No being, no organic form dependent on gravity and friction can reach the summit unaided. The angle is absolute, the wind pressure fatal. The composition of the rock itself rejects standard anchor mechanisms. This proposition is not one of arrogance, but of analysis. From the back of the crowd, Victor Ames rubbed at the side of his neck, squinting up at the cliff. He'd heard of the lecture from a vendor in the spaceport who'd tried to sell him a windproof kettle and somehow ended up describing local geological marvels. "That's a lot of talk for a rock," Victor muttered. A young technician beside him turned, his eye stalks twitching. "The professor is revered. He mapped the black holes of the Hellion cluster using only math and a mirror." Victor shrugged. "I once fixed a lunar rover with duct tape and chewing gum. We all have our talents." He pushed through the crowd just as Professor Drelks finished his declaration. "Anyone who attempts this climb will fail, not due to weakness but to the immutable facts of physics." Victor raised a hand. "What if I try anyway?" The translator clicked softly. Drelks's eyes narrowed. "You are one of the Terrans." "Name's Victor Ames," he said, stepping forward. "And no offense, but I was raised on the edge of a canyon in Arizona. Climbing rocks is kind of a family tradition. There is no tradition that can overcome what is impossible." Victor let the words hang for a moment, then looked back at the cliff. "Guess we'll see." 2 days later, Victor stood in the shadow of the Unclimbable Thought with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder and a bag of gear at his feet. A small group had gathered again, curious locals, a few off-worlders, and a cluster of Drelks's students, their data tablets hovering around them like obedient pets. "You've reviewed the environmental data?" asked a pale blue student with a floating lens over one eye. "Yeah," Victor said, tying off the first section of rope. "Winds pick up around 500 feet, rocks brittle in some sections, temperature drops the higher you go." "You still believe you can make it?" "No, I believe I can try." "That's the difference." He began the climb slowly, anchoring his line every few meters. There was no easy path, only vertical stretches broken by narrow ledges barely wide enough for a boot. The first 100 feet were straightforward. He found purchase in the rock's natural grooves, testing each hold before committing his weight. By 200 feet, the wind had started to press against him, a constant whisper that tugged at his jacket and made the rope sway. He paused, wedged into a rocky pocket to catch his breath. Beneath him, the crowd had grown. Drelks stood with his arms folded, unmoving. Victor reached 300 feet before the first problem struck. The rock beneath his left hand gave way with a brittle snap. He dropped a foot before the rope caught him, jerking his shoulder hard. Pain shot down his side and he hissed through clenched teeth. Hanging there, he tested the arm. It moved but slower than before. "Just a sprain," he muttered. "Could be worse." Getting back onto the wall took effort. He used his legs more than his arms now, pushing upward in short bursts. His breath came harder with each stretch, sweat soaking through his back despite the wind. By the time he reached 400 feet, clouds had begun to form above the cliff, dark and mean-looking. A voice crackled through the small communicator clipped to Victor's harness. "You should return." Atmospheric pressure is shifting, lightning is forming. Victor exhaled and looked up. "Can't, I'm halfway. If I turn back now, the wall wins." There was a pause. "This is irrational, maybe, but not impossible." At 500 feet, the wind howled like a living thing. Victor had to brace himself between two narrow ridges and wait out a gust strong enough to rattle his teeth. A pebble slammed into his cheek, splitting the skin. Blood ran down his jaw and into his collar. He tapped the communicator. Still climbing. Below, Professor Drelks paced for the first time, his fingers twitching. He should be unconscious, he said aloud. The oxygen levels alone, no, Professor, said one of his students. His blood chemistry adapts faster than projections suggested, the adrenaline. Drelks turned sharply. Adrenaline is not a strategy. Victor's grip slipped again near 600 feet. This time he didn't fall far, but he landed hard against the rock, his right knee slamming into a sharp edge. Pain flared white-hot. He clung to the wall, panting. He stayed there for 10 minutes, unable to move. The pain in his knee had settled into a deep, persistent throb. Carefully, he adjusted his position and examined the joint. Swollen, not broken, but it wouldn't hold his full weight. He removed a brace from his pack and tied it around the knee. Every movement after that was slower, more deliberate. He adjusted his route, leaning heavily on his arms now, favoring his left leg. By 700 feet, the jacket had torn in 3 places. His fingers were scraped raw. He kept going. At 800 feet, the clouds broke. Rain lashed sideways, turning the rock slick. Victor flattened himself against the cliff, rope looped twice around his waist, and waited. Lightning streaked across the sky, far too close. His teeth chattered from cold and exhaustion. "Pull out," said the voice on the communicator. "There is no shame in survival," Victor laughed faintly. "That's the first thing I agree with, but I didn't come here to stop 90% of the way up." The last stretch was almost vertical, with no ledge in sight. He drove a piton deep into the rock, tested the hold, and began pulling himself up inch by inch. The rain had slowed, but the wind hadn't. Each movement was a gamble. Finally, his hand touched the edge. He hauled himself over and rolled onto the summit, gasping. The sky above was bruised purple, the wind cold and sharp. He lay there, chest heaving, for a long time, then he sat up. Below, the crowd was silent. Victor raised one arm from the ground. Professor Drelks stared upward, the translator silent. Around him, no one spoke. Victor's voice came through the communicator, hoarse and scratched. "You were right. It wasn't reasonable, but it was possible." He began setting up a flag, just a simple red cloth tied to a stick, not for triumph, just to say someone had been there. The climb back down would take twice as long, and his knee would nearly give out twice. He'd spend the next 3 weeks in a medical pod while the swelling subsided and ligaments healed. He'd need physical therapy for a month after that, but he would walk again. And more importantly, the cliff wasn't unclimbable anymore. As he rested on the summit, watching the storm drift away, he whispered to no one in particular. "Bet you didn't see that coming, Professor." The infirmary on the orbital station above Virellia smelled faintly of sterile gel and melted plastic, the kind used to patch insulation seams after micrometeorite impacts. Victor lay on a padded table, his right leg suspended in a translucent brace filled with a cooling solution that pulsed every few seconds with a quiet hiss. His fingers drummed against the edge of the bed, impatient with his body's refusal to cooperate. A nurse with translucent skin and 6 elongated eyes adjusted a monitor beside him. One eye flicked in Victor's direction. "Pain level still at a 6, closer to a 7, Victor said. "But I think your machine's too polite to say so." The nurse blinked in sequence, a gesture Victor had learned meant mild disapproval. "You refused sedation during descent. That was unwise. It was either that or get lowered like a sack of potatoes." "I prefer to remember the trip." The nurse made a note on the holopad, antennae twitching. "You tore 2 ligaments. The joint is stable for now, but any sudden movement could delay regeneration. You'll need to remain immobile for 8 more hours. After that, we begin assisted motion therapy." Victor tilted his head toward the window that overlooked the planet below. "I'd rather be back down there. Your skeletal composition suggests a tendency to prefer environments where injuries occur." The nurse paused, then added, "You are not the first human we've treated. But you are the first to arrive via vertical self-endangerment." The door parted with a gentle chime. Professor Drelks entered with a subtle stiffness that wasn't from age, more like the strain of recalibrating 27 years of certainty. His eyes scanned the room, then rested on Victor. "You are conscious." Victor didn't turn away from the window. "Mostly. What brings you up here? Thought you'd be busy rewriting your lecture notes." "I came to understand." Victor finally looked at him. "Understand what?" Drelks stepped closer, folding two of his arms behind his back. "You ignored every rational model, every atmospheric warning, and every physiological threshold. You could have died." Victor shrugged. "But I didn't." "That is not an answer." Victor pointed at the brace. "This is the answer. I knew the risk. I accepted it." "I made it anyway." Drelks studied his face. "You are not a soldier. You are not a scientist. You are not pursuing knowledge or conquest. So why?" Victor leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. "You ever pick a fight with your own limits just to see if they'll flinch?" The professor did not respond immediately. He approached the monitor and examined the readouts. "The inflammation in your knee is significant. Your recovery will be uncomfortable." "I've had worse," Victor said. "There was a time I dislocated my shoulder in the middle of a sandstorm on Enceladus. Had to pop it back in using a crowbar and a tent pole." Drelks blinked. "That is unnecessary." So was the climb. Silence settled between them. The hiss of the brace filled the room again. "You knew I was watching," Drelks said quietly. Victor turned to him. "You didn't blink for 9 hours. Hard not to notice." "I assumed you would fail early, then I assumed you would fall, then I stopped assuming." Victor smiled. "Progress?" Drelks touched the edge of the monitor as if grounding himself. "What I witnessed was not madness, nor was it brilliance. It was something else." Victor nodded. "Stubbornness." "No, intimacy with uncertainty." "You treat the unknown not as a threat, but as a challenge to be personalized." Victor laughed softly. "There's a reason we keep getting into trouble with the galaxy." Drelks turned away from the monitor and approached the foot of the bed. "I reviewed your vitals in real time. Your body adapted to oxygen drop faster than projected. Your core temperature adjusted during the storm. Even your blood viscosity changed subtly to maintain circulation under stress. Humans are not designed for this, and yet you make yourselves fit." Victor shrugged again. "We learned a long time ago that the universe doesn't care if we're comfortable." There was a brief knock at the door, more a courtesy than a request, and a small figure entered carrying a container with a glowing lid. The being was Virellia, short, with a rotating cranial ring and a voice like a flute played underwater. "For the Terran," it said, setting the container on the bedside table. "From the cliff." Victor raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" The Virellia opened the lid to reveal a chunk of the cliff's uppermost stone, its surface scorched by the storm. "You touched something sacred. This is a piece of it for you." Victor stared at it. "I didn't mean to offend. You did not. You redefined it. Before, it was a boundary. Now it is a story." The Virellia turned and left without another word. Victor looked at the stone, then at Drelks. "That's going in my toolbox." Drelks tilted his head. "You intend to keep it among your tools?" "Yeah, reminds me that problems aren't solved by avoiding them." There was a pause. "I will need to revise my curriculum," Drelks said at last. "Some of my students no longer accept the premise of impassable limits." Victor chuckled. "Sorry about that. I am not." Later that evening, the brace was removed briefly for muscle response testing. 2 medics assisted as Victor shifted upright, bracing his weight on a padded frame. His leg trembled under him, the pain sharp but localized. "Move slowly," the nurse warned. Victor took half a step. His knee wobbled. He winced but kept moving. Drelks remained in the corner, silent. "Humans recover inefficiently," he observed. "But you do recover." Victor gritted his teeth through another step. "That's kind of our thing." By the end of the session, Victor had managed 6 steps with assistance. The medics declared it a promising start. As they exited, Drelks lingered. "You could have waited until someone developed a drone-assisted traversal system. But then I wouldn't have climbed it. You destroyed the idea of the unclimbable thought." "No, I just changed what it meant." Drelks nodded slowly. I will need to rename it. Victor eased back onto the bed, sweat on his brow. You could try inconvenient but doable thought, bit of a mouthful though. Drelx's expression didn't change, but one of his eyes narrowed in what Victor had learned meant reluctant amusement. I will consider it. An hour later, the lights dimmed to evening levels. Victor lay on his side, staring at the stone on the table. He reached out and touched its surface, still slightly warm from the Virellion's container. It felt ordinary, just rock. He closed his eyes and let the hiss of the brace lull him to sleep, unaware that his climb had already been uploaded to 3 educational networks, analyzed by 7 cultural boards, and declared a human behavioral anomaly of the cycle by the Interstellar Ethics Forum. He would learn about that in the morning. For now, he dreamed of falling not in fear, but in defiance, because in the dream he always caught himself. By the 3rd day of Victor's recovery, he'd memorized the ceiling patterns in the Virelian med bay and begun assigning personalities to the ventilation noises. The one that hissed every 7 seconds was a disgruntled librarian. The rattling near the eastern vent had aspirations of becoming a jazz drummer. A bulbous alien with a translucent dome for a skull hovered near the foot of his bed, holding what looked like a tray of dried coral. Its limbs flexed backward, and it had no discernible mouth. "Do I eat that?" Victor asked, "or build a suspension bridge with it?" The being blinked through bioluminescent pulses across its dome. "He finds it humorous," said the translator node attached to the wall. "The meal is medicinal. Chew slowly. It will reduce inflammation around your damaged ligaments and increase vascular oxygenation." Victor picked up a jagged piece, bit off a corner, and winced. "Tastes like a tire fire." He says that indicates it is working. The translator didn't laugh, and Victor was still unsure if the dome-headed alien had a sense of humor or just tolerated his. At noon, Professor Drelx returned. This time he carried a narrow, rectangular case. He set it gently on the table beside Victor's bed without explanation. "You brought me a gift or a threat?" A reference. Victor raised an eyebrow. "To what?" Drelx unlatched the case and opened it. Inside lay a long strip of woven material embedded with iridescent threads. At first glance it resembled a sash, but it held too much structure for that. Symbols ran along the edge, tight, recursive spirals that shimmered when viewed from different angles. "This is a record," Drelx said, "historically gifted to those who alter established parameters of inquiry. It is woven from the hair of the Mirak elders." Victor gave it a wary look. "I'm honored, also a little creeped out." "They donate the fibers voluntarily. It is a sign of respect." Victor reached out and touched the fabric. It was softer than it looked. "So what happens now?" "You hang this in a museum and add a plaque that says accidental human. Proceed with caution." "I am updating my course syllabus," Drelx replied. "The segment on impossible structures is being revised to include human variants. Glad I could make your life harder. You have made it more complex. That is not the same." Victor leaned back against the headrest. "So is that it? I get a ribbon made from ancient alien hair and you go back to lecturing about how everything has an upper limit. You misunderstand. I will never again claim such certainty where humans are concerned." Victor laughed. "That's the nicest insult I've ever gotten." Drelx sat, folding his limbs beneath him. "I have a question unrelated to climbing. Shoot. When you began the climb, you did not know if you would succeed, but you proceeded, not out of desperation, not for survival." "Then why?" Victor considered that for a while. "Because doing something nobody believes is possible. That's a language we speak. It's how we figure out who we are." Drelx tapped the edge of the sash. "This will inspire discomfort among certain academic circles. I'd apologize, but I think you're secretly enjoying it. I am curious to see which of my peers will attempt to replicate your climb with drones and declare themselves pioneers." Victor shook his head. "They're welcome to it. I wasn't trying to prove I'm better than anyone, just that the wall wasn't smarter than me." Drelx shifted, one eye blinking slower than the others. You are aware that interstellar safety commissions are now reviewing the classification of natural landmarks for public interaction. I figured something like that would happen. They're calling it the Ames Clause. Victor groaned. Please tell me that doesn't involve banning humans from cliffs. No. It involves placing signs in multiple languages advising that humans may attempt things others should not imitate. That's fair. The door opened again, and a new figure entered, tall, with segmented limbs and a flat, plated face. It wore a deep green uniform with a badge that shimmered slightly when it moved. You are Victor Ames, it said. I was last time I checked. I am Commander Virel. I represent the Virelian civil confluence. You have caused a diplomatic deviation. Victor blinked. What? Your ascent has created cultural ripples among the local species. The Virelian have declared the cliff sacred again, but now for different reasons. The Torkin believe it was a test issued by the planet itself. A group of Silvani monks are planning a pilgrimage. Victor rubbed his forehead. I just climbed a rock. You altered a shared symbol. Symbols are volatile. Drelk stood but didn't interject. Commander Virel continued. You are not being punished, but you are being requested to speak at the Harmonic Council. They require clarification. On what? Your motives, your methods, your species' tendency toward reckless perseverance. Victor sighed. Look, if I'd known this was going to turn into a planetary seminar on human stubbornness, I might have stayed in bed that morning. That is not a denial. Victor swung his legs over the side of the bed. The brace hissed once but didn't resist. He stood slowly, bearing weight carefully on both legs. You're walking, Drelks observed. Not elegantly, Victor said, but yeah, Commander Virel stepped aside. A transport is ready. If you agree to speak, we can depart within the hour. Victor looked at the sash, then at Drelks, then at the chunk of cliff stone still resting beside the bed. All right, he said, but I'm not promising they'll like what I have to say. They do not require comfort, they require honesty. On the way out, Victor paused. Hey, Professor, Drelks looked up. I'm not climbing anything else while I'm here, I swear. That is acceptable, Drelks said. But statistically unlikely. Victor gave a lopsided grin. You're learning. The transport bay was quiet, the kind of quiet that suggested someone had recently argued about logistics and then decided to pretend the conversation never happened. Victor ducked into the low-slung shuttle and settled into a harness as it lifted off. As the planet curved beneath them, he saw the plateau again, the cliff rising from it like a stubborn thought that refused to be dismissed. He tapped the side of the shuttle. You know, he said to no one in particular, next time someone tells me something's impossible, I'm going to ask if they've checked to see if a human already did it. The pilot, a two-headed avian species who hadn't spoken a word until then, said, statistically, that will become the standard question. Victor leaned back, eyes closed, leg aching but functional. Let the council ask their questions. Let the scholars debate it. He'd climbed the cliff. That was enough. No handshakes, no parades, just a rock, a rope, and the knowledge that sometimes the most human thing in the universe was to look at a wall and say, that doesn't get to tell me no.